My wife of 11 years sat across from me in our kitchen and told me she wanted everything. The house, the business, the accounts, all of it. Her lawyer had already prepared the papers. My own brother had signed a statement supporting her claim. And my two stepchildren, the ones I had raised since they were small, had already moved their things out of my house without saying a word to me. Everyone around me said I was finished. My lawyer begged me to fight. Instead, I smiled, picked up the pen, and signed exactly what they asked for. They celebrated that night. They had no idea what was coming. If you enjoy dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Francisko's Stories for more. We post new stories every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story did not start with betrayal. It started with love, real love, the kind that makes you believe everything is possible. I met Sandra at a work conference in the spring of 2011. She was sharp, funny, and had a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. She had 2 children from her first marriage, a boy named Tyler, who was 9 at the time, and a girl named Mia, who had just turned 7. From the moment I met those kids, I felt something shift inside me. I never had children of my own. I always told myself I was fine with that. But when Tyler shook my hand and looked me dead in the eye like a little man, and when Mia handed me a drawing she had made of a butterfly, something opened up in me that I did not know was closed. Sandra and I got married 18 months later. It was a small ceremony. My brother Daniel was my best man. Her parents flew in from out of state. It was one of the happiest days of my life. For the first few years, things were good. Not perfect, no family is, but genuinely good. I adopted Tyler and Mia legally. I paid for their schools, their sports, their trips. I drove them to practice at 6 in the morning. I helped with homework. I attended every school play and every parent-teacher conference. I treated those children as if they were born from me, because in every way that mattered, they were mine. My business was doing well too. I owned a mid-sized logistics company. We handled supply chain management for several regional clients. It was not glamorous work, but it was solid, profitable, and built entirely by my own hands over 12 years. I had started it from nothing. 1 van, 1 client, 1 contract at a time. By the time I met Sandra, the company had 23 employees and was bringing in just over $2 million a year in revenue. When we got married, I made Sandra a co-owner, 50%. My accountant advised against it. My lawyer at the time, a cautious older man named Gerald, said I should wait. But I loved her, I trusted her, and I believed that what was mine should be ours. That decision would come back to me in ways I could not have imagined. The first signs of trouble came quietly, the way trouble usually does. Small things. Sandra started spending more time on her phone. She became distant at dinner. She began criticizing things she used to praise, the way I ran the business, the way I spoke to clients, the hours I kept. At first, I thought it was stress. She had started working part-time as a consultant, and I assumed the adjustment was difficult. Then, one evening in the fall of 2019, I came home early from a client meeting that had been canceled. The house was quiet. Sandra's car was in the driveway, but I did not see her downstairs. I went to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, and that is when I noticed her phone on the counter, face up, screen still lit. I am not a man who reads other people's messages. I never had been. But something made me stop. A name caught my eye. Just a name. Raymond. I did not pick up the phone. I told myself it meant nothing. I went upstairs, changed my clothes, and went back to work. But that name stayed in my head like a splinter I could not quite reach. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention. Not in an obsessive way, just the natural awareness that comes when something feels wrong and you cannot name it yet. I noticed that Sandra started going to client dinners on evenings she had never worked before. I noticed that she began locking her phone in a drawer when she was home. I noticed that she started asking me questions about the business, detailed questions about accounts and contracts, questions she had never cared about before. I told myself I was being paranoid. I tried to focus on work and on the kids. Tyler was 20 by then, in his second year of college. He came home on weekends sometimes, and I always made sure there was food ready and money on his card. Mia was 18 and had just started at a local design school. She still lived at home. She was creative and quiet, and I had always felt a special closeness with her. Then, one Saturday morning in January of 2020, everything changed. Sandra sat me down at the kitchen table. Her face was calm in the way that faces are calm when a decision has already been made and the words are simply being delivered. She said, "I think we should separate." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Is there someone else?" She did not answer right away. Then she said, "That is not the point. The marriage is not working." I asked her to go to counseling. She refused. I asked if we could take some time before making any permanent decisions. She said her mind was made up. She had already spoken to a lawyer. I remember sitting there after she left the room, looking at the morning light coming through the window, and feeling something very strange. Not the pain I expected. Not panic. Something quieter. Something that felt almost like clarity. I called my lawyer the next morning. Not Gerald. Gerald had retired. I had a new lawyer, a younger man named Paul, who'd been handling my business contracts for the past 2 years. I told him what was happening. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much does she know about the business finances?" I said, "Enough." He said, "We need to get ahead of this." What happened over the next 3 months was a slow-motion unraveling. Sandra's lawyer, an aggressive woman named Christine, sent over a proposed settlement that was breathtaking in its ambition. Sandra was claiming half of everything, half the business, half the property, half of the retirement accounts. And because she was claiming that I had been emotionally neglectful, a term her lawyer used liberally, she was also asking for substantial monthly support. Paul called me after reading the proposal. He said, "This is extreme. We fight this. We document everything. Your contributions to the household, the business records, the adoption costs, the children's expenses. We build a case that shows how much you gave to this family." I told him I would think about it. Then something else happened that I had not expected. My brother Daniel called me one evening. Daniel was 3 years younger than me. We had always been close, or so I believed. He said he wanted to talk. I invited him over. He sat down, accepted a cup of coffee, and then told me something that hit me harder than anything Sandra had said. He told me that he had been speaking to Sandra's lawyer, that he had agreed to provide a statement in support of Sandra's claim. He said that he believed the business had partly succeeded because of conversations and ideas that Sandra had contributed over the years, and that she deserved proper recognition for that. I stared at him. I said, "Daniel, you were at my company's first office. You helped me move equipment. You know what I built and how I built it." He looked away. He said, "I'm sorry. I think it's the right thing to do." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I just nodded slowly and said, "Okay." He seemed surprised by that. He had expected a fight. I could see it in the way his shoulders were braced. When I did not give him one, he looked almost confused. After he left, I sat in the dark for a long time. 2 days later, Mia came to me in the kitchen. She was packing some boxes. She would not fully meet my eyes. She said, "Dad, I'm going to stay at Mom's apartment for a while." I said, "Okay, sweetheart. Do you have everything you need?" She paused. She said, "I just think Mom needs me right now." I said, "I understand." She hugged me quickly and left. Tyler had already stopped returning my calls, so there I was. My wife was leaving. My brother had turned against me. My stepchildren, the children I had raised and adopted and loved, had walked out without looking back. And every person around me, including my own lawyer, believed that I was about to lose everything. Paul kept pushing me to fight. He would call me every few days with a new strategy, a new angle, a new document to sign. He was energetic and capable and genuinely on my side, and I kept telling him the same thing. "Let me think about it. Let me think about it. Let me think about it." He got frustrated. One afternoon, he came to my office and sat down across from my desk and said, "I need you to understand what's at stake here. If you don't contest this settlement, she walks away with half a business you spent over a decade building, plus the house, plus support payments. You will be starting over from zero." I looked at him across the desk. I said, "Paul, I want you to send them a message. Tell them I'm prepared to accept the settlement as proposed." He went very still. He said, "I'm sorry?" I said, "Tell them I accept. He leaned forward. He said, "Are you feeling all right? Because this is not a small decision. This is the rest of your life." I said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Do you?" I said, "Trust me." He did not look like a man who trusted me. He looked like a man watching someone step in front of a train. But he was my lawyer, and he followed my instructions. The news traveled fast. Sandra's lawyer called Paul within the hour, barely containing her surprise. Sandra called me that evening, the first real conversation we had in weeks. Her voice was careful, like she was checking for a trap. She said, "I heard you're accepting the settlement." I said, "That's right." She said, "All of it? You're not contesting anything?" I said, "No." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Why?" I said, "Because I want this to be over." Another pause. Then, "Okay." She hung up. I imagined her sitting there with her lawyer, trying to figure out what I knew, trying to find the angle. But there was no angle to find. Not on the surface. What none of them understood was this. 6 months before Sandra asked for a separation, I had already made a decision. It had started as a routine business review. Every year in the summer, I sat down with my accountant, a meticulous woman named Helen, and we went through everything: revenue, expenses, projections, structure. It was during that review in the summer of 2019, 4 months before I saw the name Raymond on Sandra's phone, that Helen flagged something unusual. She had discovered that the main operating company, the one Sandra was listed as co-owner of, had quietly become a shell. Over the previous 18 months, the actual contracts, the client relationships, the employees, the equipment, almost everything of real value, had been methodically transferred to a new entity I had created called Ridgeline Logistics Solutions. Ridgeline was not new in the sense of being created overnight. It had been in formation for over 2 years, initially as a separate division I was exploring for expansion purposes. But as the business grew and as Helen and I looked more carefully at the corporate structure for tax efficiency purposes, we realized something important. Sandra was co-owner of the original company. She was not a listed owner of Ridgeline. Now, here's where I want to be precise, because this matters. I did not create Ridgeline to cheat Sandra. I created it before there was any problem in the marriage, for legitimate business reasons. And when Helen pointed out the structural difference, I did not immediately think about divorce. I thought about whether I needed to update the ownership documents, but I did not update them. And 6 months later, when Sandra sat me down at the kitchen table, I understood why my instincts had hesitated. The original company, the one with Sandra's name on it, had 3 aging client contracts that were expiring within the year, 2 old vans that needed replacing, and a bank account with modest working capital. On paper, it looked like a business. It had a history and a name, but the engine had moved. The real business, the 23 employees, the 7 active long-term contracts, the new fleet, the revenue, all of it lived inside Ridgeline. Sandra's lawyers were very good. Christine was sharp and aggressive and had clearly done her research. But they researched the company they knew about, the one on the original incorporation documents, the one Sandra was co-owner of. They had no idea that Ridgeline existed. Not yet. When I accepted the settlement, here's what I accepted. Sandra would receive her 50% of the original company. She would receive the house, which had a mortgage she would now be responsible for. She would receive half the joint savings account, which was real money. I will not pretend otherwise. And she would receive monthly support payments for 2 years, after which they would end. What she did not receive, because her lawyers never asked for it and never knew to ask for it, was any share of Ridgeline Logistics Solutions, which by that point was generating approximately 80% of what had been my total business revenue. Her lawyers had accepted my offer so quickly, so relieved that I was not fighting, that they never dug deeper. They had celebrated a victory without fully understanding what they had won. I want you to understand something. I did not feel triumphant in those days. I felt sad. A sadness that sat heavy in my chest every morning when I woke up in that house before I handed over the keys. I had loved Sandra. I had loved those kids. The fact that I was not destroyed by their betrayal did not mean I felt nothing. It meant I had simply made peace with it before they finished sharpening their knives. The signing happened on a Thursday afternoon in Christine's office. Sandra and her lawyer sat on one side of the table. Paul and I sat on the other. There were papers everywhere. I signed each one without hesitation. I did not argue about a single line. Christine kept glancing at me with a look I can only describe as suspicious satisfaction, like a woman who had caught a fish, but could not quite believe it was not putting up a fight. When it was done, Sandra looked at me across the table. I thought she might say something. For a moment, her expression shifted. Something passed across her face that looked almost like regret. Then it was gone. She picked up her bag and walked out. Paul gathered the papers in silence. When we got to the parking lot, he turned to me. He said, "Okay, I've done what you asked. Now will you please tell me what is going on?" I said, "Let's get coffee." We sat in a cafe around the corner, and I laid it out for him. All of it. Ridgeline, the structure, the transfers, the timing. I walked him through every detail while he sat very still with his coffee untouched, listening. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She got 50% of a company that has almost no active business." I said, "Correct." He said, "And Ridgeline," I said, "is entirely mine." Another pause. He picked up his coffee. He said, "You planned this," I said. "I didn't plan the divorce, I planned the business." He looked at me carefully. He said, "Is this legal?" I said, "Helen has reviewed every step. Every transfer was documented, properly valued, properly filed. Ridgeline was a legitimate business restructuring. I did not hide it. It is registered. It pays its taxes. It simply was never part of the marital asset pool because Sandra was never an owner of it." He sat back. He said, "And they never asked." I said, "They never asked." He shook his head slowly. He said, "How long did you know?" I said, "I knew the structure before the problem started. I understood what it meant when the problem started." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "For what?" He said, "For thinking you had lost your mind." I smiled. The first real smile in months. The weeks after the signing were strange. Sandra moved into her apartment. She took on the house mortgage with what appeared to be confidence. Tyler and Mia remained distant. Daniel sent me a brief text saying he hoped things would work out. I did not respond. I moved into a smaller place, a clean, simple apartment across the city. I liked it. It was quiet. I could think clearly there. About 3 weeks after the signing, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Raymond. I had figured out by then that Raymond was a man Sandra had met through her consulting work. I did not know the full history of their relationship, and I did not need to. But the fact that he was calling me was unexpected. His voice was nervous. He said, "I just want you to know that I had nothing to do with how things went. That was between you and Sandra. I'm not a bad person." I said, "I don't know you, Raymond. I have no opinion about you." He seemed surprised by that. He said, "She told me you would be angry." I said, "I'm not angry." He paused. Then he said, "She's asking me to invest in the company, the logistics company. She says it's worth a lot and she needs capital to grow it." I let that sit for a moment. I said, "That's a business decision only you can make." He said, "What would you do?" I said, "I'd do a thorough due diligence before investing in any business." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is there something I should know?" I said, "I'm not in a position to advise you. I'd just say, look carefully at the current contracts, the active ones, the revenue. Make sure the numbers match what you're being told." He said, "That sounds like a warning." I said, "It sounds like common sense." He hung up. I never heard from him again. But 3 months later, through a contact in the industry, I heard that Raymond had declined to invest. I also heard that Sandra had hired a business consultant to review the company, and that the consultant had delivered some difficult news. The original company had almost nothing left to grow. One of the old contracts expired, then the second. The third was renegotiated by the client at a fraction of its original value because the service capability had quietly degraded as the real operational staff had migrated to Ridgeline. The old vans broke down. The few remaining staff began looking for other work. I heard all of this from a distance. I did not feel satisfaction. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more complicated. A kind of heavy tiredness that comes after a long storm has finally passed. Then, in the spring of that year, about 5 months after the signing, Christine called Paul. Paul called me immediately after. He said, "Sandra's lawyer just called me. They want to discuss whether there are undisclosed business assets." I said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her I would speak with my client." I said, "Set up a meeting." We met in Christine's office again. The atmosphere was very different this time. Sandra was there and she looked tired. Christine was controlled, but I could see the tension in her jaw. She had done her homework. She had found Ridgeline. Christine laid a folder on the table. She said, "We have recently become aware of a business entity called Ridgeline Logistics Solutions, in which you are the sole owner. We believe this entity represents a substantial marital asset that was not disclosed during settlement negotiations." Paul looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He said, "Ridgeline Logistics Solutions is a legally registered business entity created prior to the matrimonial difficulties in this case. All formation documents, tax filings, and financial records are fully available and have been filed with the appropriate authorities. It was never concealed. It was not listed as a marital asset because it was never owned jointly. My client's former spouse was not a shareholder, was not a creditor, and had no legal interest in the entity at any point." Christine said, "We would argue that the growth of that entity relied on marital resources and should have been included in asset disclosure." Paul opened his own folder. He said, "We would be happy to walk through the formation timeline and the capitalization records. Ridgeline was capitalized through premarital business accounts. Its initial contracts were developed independently. We have detailed records supporting every claim." Christine looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at the table. Christine said, "We may seek to reopen the settlement." Paul said, "You are welcome to file whatever motions you consider appropriate. We are confident in our position." The motion was filed. I will not pretend it was not stressful. Months of legal back and forth. Depositions. Document requests. Helen, my accountant, was extraordinary, methodical and unflappable, with records for every transaction going back years. She sat in that deposition room like a woman who had been waiting her whole career for exactly this moment. In the end, the judge reviewed everything, the timeline, the capitalization, the structure, the filings, and he ruled that Ridgeline Logistics Solutions was a legitimate, properly constituted business entity that predated the marital breakdown and had no joint ownership basis. The settlement stood as signed. Sandra's motion was denied. Christine appealed. The appeal was heard 6 months later. The appellate panel reviewed the records and upheld the original ruling. Ridgeline was mine. The day Paul called me to deliver the final decision, I was sitting in my apartment with a cup of coffee, watching the rain on the window. He called, told me the ruling, and said, "It's over. You won." I said, "I know." He laughed a little. He said, "You knew this whole time, didn't you?" I said, "I knew the facts. The facts were on my side." He said, "I've been a lawyer for 16 years. I've never seen anything quite like this." I said, "Paul, I never did anything dishonest. I just didn't do anything unnecessary." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, you didn't. Now I want to tell you about the part that still stays with me. Not the legal outcome, not the business, something else." About 2 months after the appeal was decided, I received a call from Mia. Her voice was quiet. She said, "Dad?" I said, "Hey, sweetheart." She paused for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry." I did not say anything. I just let her speak. She said, "I was scared. Mom was upset and I thought I was supposed to choose. And Tyler kept saying you were hiding money and that you had tricked everyone, and I believed him because he was so sure." Her voice cracked. She said, "But then I started looking things up and talking to people. And I realized that you didn't do anything wrong. You were just prepared. And I wasn't there for you when I should have been. I held the phone and looked at the rain on the window and felt something loosen in my chest. I said, "You were 18 years old and your family was falling apart. I don't blame you for being scared." She started crying. She said, "Do you hate me?" I said, "I could never hate you. You are my daughter." She said, "But I'm not really." I said, "You are my daughter. That has never changed. Not once." We talked for 2 hours that night about everything, about how the year had felt, about her design school and a project she was proud of, about small things, easy things, the kind of things you talk about when the big things have finally been said. Tyler took longer. It was almost a full year before he called. His tone was different from Mia's, more guarded, less ready to be vulnerable. But he called, and in his own careful way, he apologized. He said he had been told things that turned out not to be accurate. He said he was not proud of how he had handled it. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him the door was open. That was all either of us needed. Daniel I have not heard from since. That loss is real. I will not minimize it. He is my brother, and I grew up with him, and there is a specific kind of grief that comes from losing someone like that, someone you thought you knew. But I have made peace with it. Some bridges are not rebuilt. They are simply acknowledged and then left behind. As for the business, Ridgeline continued to grow. We expanded into 2 new regions. We added 12 new employees in the year after the legal case was resolved. Helen and I brought in a new operations director and a young logistics coordinator who turned out to be exceptional. The company I had built from 1 van and 1 contract was now something I was genuinely proud of. I did not return to the house. I stayed in my apartment. I bought a few good pieces of furniture. I planted some herbs on the windowsill. I cooked dinner most evenings and listened to music and read before bed. I was not lonely in the way people imagined a man in my position would be. I was quiet. And for the first time in many years, the quiet felt chosen. People sometimes ask me how I stayed so calm through all of it, how I did not rage or panic or collapse when the people I loved were walking out the door and my lawyer was telling me I was making the worst mistake of his career. I always think about what my father used to say. He was a practical man, my father, not poetic. He ran a small hardware store for 30 years. He had a saying he used whenever something went wrong, when a shipment was late, when a supplier cheated him, when a competitor undercut his prices. He would stand behind his counter, look at whatever problem had just arrived and say, "Don't chase, just know where the river goes." I never fully understood that as a kid. I thought it was just something old men said. But I understand it now. It means that most things follow their nature. Water flows downhill, greed overreaches, panic makes bad decisions. If you understand the nature of what is happening, if you are not blinded by your own fear or anger, you can position yourself quietly and let events unfold. Sandra's mistake was not falling out of love with me. People fall out of love. That is human, and I cannot fault her for it. Her mistake was the assumption that followed, the assumption that I was weak enough to be taken from. She looked at my patience and saw paralysis. She looked at my calm and saw defeat. She mistook the river for a puddle. Daniel made the same mistake. He saw a man who had not yet swung a punch and assumed the man could not fight. He was wrong about what kind of fight was coming, and in the end, they were all working very hard to win something they did not fully understand. They were racing to claim a prize while I had already quietly moved the prize somewhere else and was watching from a distance. I'm not telling this story to gloat. I want to be clear about that. The people who hurt me, Sandra, Daniel, even Tyler in those early months, they are still people, still human, still capable of their own pain and their own growth. I do not need them to suffer to feel that justice was done. What I needed was simply for the truth to hold. And it did. There is something else I want to say, something I have thought about a great deal in the time since all of this unfolded. I think we live in a world that rewards loudness. Anger gets attention. Threats get response. Dramatic confrontations get results, or at least they seem to. And so when someone is quiet, when someone does not shout back, does not threaten, does not perform their anger for an audience, the The people around them often read that silence as weakness. But silence is not the same as surrender. There's a kind of confidence that only comes from knowing something that no one else knows. A stillness that is not emptiness but fullness. When you know the truth, when you have built something real, documented something carefully, and positioned yourself with patience and precision, you do not need to yell. You do not need to threaten. You do not need to convince anyone of anything in the moment, because the moment will pass and the truth will remain. That is what I held on to through every phone call, every signing, every cold morning in that apartment. Not rage, not revenge, just the quiet knowledge that the river was already going where it needed to go. If I could go back and do anything differently, I would probably try harder to save my marriage earlier, not out of weakness, but because I genuinely loved Sandra at one point. And perhaps that love deserved more direct conversation before it reached the table with the papers and the lawyers. I do not know if it would have changed anything, but I think it is worth saying that the goal was never to win. The goal was always something simpler, to not lose what I had built, to protect what was mine, to come out the other side still standing. I am still standing. The apartment is quiet this evening. The herbs on the windowsill need watering. There is a contract on my desk for a new regional client that I will review in the morning. And somewhere across this city, my daughter Mia is finishing a design project that she is going to show me on Saturday. She is talented. She always was. Tyler and I are going to watch a game together next week. It will not be perfect. We are still finding our way back to each other, but we are finding it. That is enough. That is more than enough. My father used to say, "Don't chase, just know where the river goes." I know now. I always did. And the river is flowing just fine.